By the time Henry VIII reached the last years of his reign, he was no longer the athletic, handsome monarch who had once dazzled Europe. Instead, he had become a grotesque shadow of himself. The man who in his youth jousted in gleaming armor, hunted tirelessly across the countryside, and charmed women at court, was now a prisoner of his own body. Henry's decline began after a jousting accident in 1536. A horse toppled over him, crushing his leg. The wound never properly healed, and it festered into a chronic ulcer that would ooze pus and emit a foul odor that even his courtiers could not ignore. Imagine trying to rule an empire while your leg constantly burned, infected, and refused to close. Doctors of the time had little to offer. They drained it, applied poultices, and whispered prayers, but nothing could relieve the pain. As the years passed, Henry's weight ballooned. By the end of his life, he was estimated to weigh over 400 pounds, his once muscular frame smothered in fat. He had to be hoisted onto horseback with mechanical pulleys, and eventually, he could hardly walk. He suffered from gout, insomnia, migraines, and possibly diabetes. His courtiers often described his face as swollen and red, his eyes clouded with rage and paranoia. But Henry's greatest prison was his temper. Pain and illness made him volatile. Those who once enjoyed his favor lived in constant terror of falling from grace. His wives, ministers, and even close friends knew that the king's moods could turn on a single word. One day, you were his confidant. The next, you might find yourself accused of treason. His paranoia sharpened as his body failed him. The mighty King of England was, by his final years, barely able to leave his chamber. His palaces were filled with the stench of rotting ulcers and sickness. Yet even then, he demanded endless feasts of roasted meats and sugary delicacies. Servants carried platters into his chambers while doctors begged him to restrain his appetite. He did not listen. Henry VIII, who once commanded armies and dictated the fate of his kingdom, now lived at war with his own flesh. His body, once a weapon of power, had become a grotesque cage. And in this cage, his final days grew closer, darker, and far more horrific. Section 2. The Tyrant in Decline. By the 1540s, Henry's reign had become a theatre of fear. His body might have been failing, but his will to command and to destroy his enemies was as fierce as ever. Ministers, nobles, even his closest allies treaded carefully around the ailing monarch. His paranoia had grown sharper than ever before. Henry's courtiers described a king consumed by suspicion. He would glare across the room, convinced that men whispered about his health. He accused trusted advisors of treason, and executions became almost routine. The Tower of London rang with the cries of nobles who had once dined at his table. Even Catherine Howard, his fifth wife, could not escape. She was dragged to the scaffold after being accused of adultery, leaving Henry embittered and alone once more. By this stage, his ulcerated leg had become a grotesque spectacle. Accounts say that attendants lanced it daily to release pus and blood. The smell was so foul that courtiers stuffed herbs into their noses just to endure his presence. Henry himself was tormented, raging at his physicians for failing to cure him. His size, too, had become legendary. Contemporary sources suggest he wore a waist measurement of over 54 inches, and his once magnificent armor had to be specially modified to fit his swollen body. To his subjects, this transformation was almost symbolic. The king who had broken from Rome, dissolved monasteries, and reshaped England into his will, was himself falling apart. Despite his failing health, Henry still sought to maintain the appearance of authority. He would summon ministers to his chambers, issuing orders from the confines of his chair. But his voice was often weak, his thoughts clouded by pain. Even those who feared him could see he was no longer the man he had been. Perhaps the most chilling part of Henry's decline was his refusal to show weakness. To the very end, he demanded that courtiers bow, flatter, and fear him. His presence still carried weight, though his body sagged with disease. In his mind, he was still the king ordained by God. To admit frailty was unthinkable. But no amount of bluster could mask the reality. Henry VIII was crumbling. His empire might have stretched across oceans, but within his own palace walls, death stalked him daily. Section 3. The final illness. By late 1546, Henry's health had reached its breaking point. Physicians of the age noted that he suffered from fevers, insomnia, and difficulty breathing. His swollen body retained fluids, his legs ulcerated and grotesquely enlarged. Some modern historians suspect kidney failure, congestive heart failure, and complications of diabetes all played their role in dragging the king toward his deathbed. Despite his condition, Henry still attempted to rule. He signed documents, gave orders, and demanded obedience. But his council, including Edward Seymour and Archbishop Cranmer, increasingly made decisions for him. Behind the throne, factions plotted who would control the kingdom once the king was gone. The king's moods turned darker with every passing day. His chamberlains whispered of violent outbursts, in which Henry would roar at his doctors for failing him, or lash out at attendants for moving too slowly. He demanded food even when he could not eat it, a grotesque reminder of his former appetites. By January of 1547, the king's condition could no longer be ignored. He could hardly rise from bed. The ulcers on his legs festered to the point that physicians dared not touch them. Rumors spread among courtiers that his flesh was literally rotting. The smell within his chamber was unbearable, a miasma of decay and sickness that few could stand. On his deathbed, Henry reportedly called for Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. But by the time Cranmer arrived, Henry could no longer speak. The man who had once thundered against the Pope, who had ordered wives to their deaths and reshaped his kingdom with fire and blood, could only grasp the Archbishop's hand weakly. With his final strength, he squeezed it. His last act before slipping into silence. On January 28, 1547, King Henry VIII died at the age of 55. His once mighty body, swollen with disease, finally gave out. He left behind a kingdom transformed, but also fractured. His 9-year-old son, Edward VI, inheriting a throne beset with danger. The death of Henry VIII was not a peaceful passing of a great monarch. It was the slow, agonizing collapse of a man undone by his own excesses, his own fury, and his own body. Section 4. Legacy of a rotting king. Henry VIII's death did not bring immediate peace. In fact, his legacy was as grotesque and divisive as the man himself. His body, too massive and infected to embalm properly, was placed in a coffin that reportedly leaked during transport. The once magnificent king was reduced to a rotting corpse, carried under cover of night to St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. Whispers spread among his subjects that this was divine punishment, that God himself had struck Henry down for his arrogance and cruelty. Some claimed that dogs licked the leaked fluids from his coffin during the journey, a ghastly image that many took as symbolic of his reign. Yet for all his horrors, Henry had undeniably changed England forever. He had broken the country from Rome, declared himself head of the Church of England, and seized the wealth of monasteries. He had executed wives and ministers with cold efficiency. But he had also created a centralized monarchy, expanded England's naval power, and laid the groundwork for future empires. Still, his final days linger in memory not as those of a glorious ruler, but as those of a tyrant consumed by his own appetites. His decline became a warning. Power cannot shield a man from his own body, nor can a crown protect him from the slow decay of age and disease. Today, Henry VIII remains one of history's most infamous kings. His youth is remembered for charm and strength, but his end is remembered for grotesque suffering. He became the very image of corruption, a monarch who could command armies but not control his own flesh. The story of Henry's final days is not only about death, but about the irony of kingship. Here was a man who bent nations to his will, who terrified subjects and reshaped religions, brought low by ulcers, obesity, and the very human stench of mortality. The horrific final days of King Henry VIII remind us that no matter how mighty the throne, the body beneath it is always fragile.